Hi, I'm Anthony Underwood, and this is Greetings from Appalachia. Thank you for joining us for this week's show. I will be interviewing Eric Engle, a labor union leader and climate crisis activist from central Appalachia's mid-Ohio Valley. But first, at the time of this show, President Biden and a bipartisan group of senators have tentatively agreed on a $1 trillion infrastructure package. This bill exclusively includes what is known as hard infrastructure. Items such as roads, bridges, public transportation, scaled-down tax incentives for electric vehicles, and money for broadband expansion. It's not a bad bill, of course, but it should have been better and bigger. The original proposal from the Biden administration was for $3.5 trillion. That included not just hard infrastructure and more money for tax subsidies for electric vehicles, but it also included money for renewable electric power generation, expanded affordable child care, greater access to the internet for rural and urban underserved areas, and more. All things in desperate need by those in Appalachia, especially those who were considered essential workers when the pandemic hit, but are now, like before the pandemic, treated as disposable workers. Despite this larger infrastructure bill being very popular with voters across the country, even supported by a majority of Republican voters, and especially popular up and down Appalachia, Republican senators have worked hard to prevent a vote on the matter up until now. What's most unusual is that they are, in large part, led by Democratic Senator Joe Manchin III, who represents the most Appalachian state in the country, West Virginia. Senators Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, the Harley Quinn to Manchin's Joker, are not only insisting that the filibuster stay in place despite its racist origins to make sure that Republicans maintain a veto over such measures, but that deals on infrastructure, voting rights, and any other important issue must include Republican senators whose stated goals are to never let any Democratic idea pass. They're literally asking the foxes if they would like to co-design the chicken coop.
There's more than one way to plug a chicken. Psychology. Why should I just get one when I can get them all?
Manchin and his blue dog or conservative Democrat faction, small as it is now, has been described as having too much power. But they don't. This is Mitch McConnell and his right-wing cynical game playing. This is a measure of McConnell's power, not Joe Manchin's, because Manchin is a dupe. He's like the idiot doddering king being controlled by his evil advisor.
Now then, perhaps I can divine a solution to this thorny problem.
If anyone can help, it's you.
But it would require the use of a mystic blue diamond.
Oh, my ring? But it's been in the family for years.
It is necessary to find the princess a suitor. Don't worry. Everything will be fine.
Everything will be fine.
He's like that spouse or a significant other who's always just been given barely enough affection to believe that if they comply, if they don't complain that they're about their abusive spouse, that they will be showered with the affection and attention and respect they want and deserve. When in reality, it's all about power.
By the power of Grayskull.
Even worse is the political gaslighting that McConnell and the other cynical Republicans constantly pull off against Manchin and his clueless allies. Every time the progressive left suggests the most modest of proposals that most other liberal democracies would view as centrist proposals, not only do the Republicans in the Senate call it a socialist baby-eating scheme, but people like Manchin and Sinema demand to know how we're going to pay for it. This is likely because of the extreme amounts of corporate and private donations that keep Manchin's political career and personal wealth afloat. They simply don't want to pay their fair taxes for these new programs. You'll notice that when the money is wanted for unwanted defense systems rejected by the Pentagon, there's never a debate about how much it's going to cost. For example, here's a picture of history's most advanced tank used by the United States military and built to take on the Soviet Union in a land war. That country doesn't exist anymore. And Russia's military is so weak they would never challenge us in the field. The military doesn't want these tanks and can't use them. This is a picture not of active tanks, but the stockpile of unwanted tanks. Yet, Congress forces them to make them year after year, no matter the cost, because tanks are made and assembled in many different congressional districts and states. It's really a federal jobs program where most of the benefits go not to the workers, but to the defense companies. To be clear, for things the Pentagon doesn't want. Which is probably the same way that those gangly, unpractical Imperial walkers got made in the Star Wars universe. I mean, come on, if a bunch of barely intelligent teddy bears can defeat them, then I doubt the Imperial military actually wanted them. But I'm sure the parts for those Imperial walkers were made on 60 different planets, and that the Emperor's inner circle got all the contracts. But the issue of money cuts in a different way as well in the run-up to much of the debate about whether or not the filibuster should be eliminated so that we can pass progressive initiatives with a simple majority in the Senate, or even have a fulsome infrastructure bill for all of the things in our society that are crumbling, either literally or metaphorically. Joe Manchin did the most important thing in this for Joe Manchin. He consulted with his biggest donors, not his citizens, donors that he shares with the Republican Party. In fact, recently, when his fellow Democratic Party members in the Texas legislature left their session to prevent Texas Republicans from stripping voting rights from their citizens, Joe Manchin went to Texas, not to support the Democrats, but to raise money for himself from Republican donors. Joe Manchin certainly has the appearance, by his own actions, of being a coin-operated senator. With his fortunes arrayed against his own party and the Appalachian people he represents. We need nationally funded child care. We need nationally mandated paid maternity and paternity leave. We need free community and technical college. We need high-quality Wi-Fi internet access nationwide, regardless of where you happen to live. And we need a livable minimum wage. And while we share those needs with our fellow citizens in urban locations and in rural suburbs, there is no doubt that Appalachians, the people that Manchin represents, needs these things as much or more than anyone else. But it seems all Manchin cares about are the coins you put in his slot. And now for our interview. Eric Engle is a public sector union steward, climate activist, and activist on behalf of the non-theist and secular community in the Mid-Ohio Valley. Let's welcome Eric. Welcome, Eric, and thank you for being here. I appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, we love having you here. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what it means to be a progressive, how progressive movements work or should work, and some of the pitfalls that they may fall into. So why don't we start off by talking about what exactly does it mean to be progressive, and how is that term commonly misunderstood?
Well, I think the working definition of progressive is anything that would move, especially traditionally marginalized communities of people, forward in a sense of doing better, having better quality of life, more longevity in life, more ability to enjoy life. And of course, that's people-centric, but it also involves every aspect of life, including nature and the broader community and our variability to inhabit the planet, right? Because that's conducive to our happiness. So I think being progressive is all about looking beyond your traditional power structures and institutions and looking toward building a better life for everyone possible, not just any subgroup of people. That's kind of my working definition of what I consider progressive or progressivism.
And often, even though they have the best of intentions, progressive movements or organizations are often led by folks who are used to being in a leadership position, or at least used to thinking of themselves that way, which all too often are cisgendered folks or males or white folks. And that kind of leads me to my next question is, what is the role of diversity and inclusion in progressive movements? You said, you talked about how it has a lot to do with the disadvantaged populations or populations that haven't been included in power structures before. So how does diversity and inclusion fit in there?
I think diversity and inclusion are incredibly important in and of themselves, but they can also be a pitfall. When you start to focus on diversity and inclusion maybe too intently, you start to lose other aspects of what progress and progressivism is supposed to be. And so I think when diversity inclusion needs to extend to the socioeconomic realm. In other words, a lot of times we don't think in terms of, are we including the truly socioeconomically disadvantaged in our communities? Are we giving them a chance to move up regardless of race or gender or sexual orientation or any other identity or core part of who they are? So diversity, inclusion are incredibly important for multiple reasons, and some of the traditional reasons that you think of in terms of incorporating people of different races that have traditionally been excluded, of different sexual orientations and gender identities that have been excluded, women and their reproductive rights. All of this is absolutely crucial, but they all tie in and cannot be separated from, cannot be siloed off from socioeconomic and class identities. So those are extremely important. And when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, you cannot exclude those.
And that's a point of view that's very much from the democratic socialist position, that you can't disassociate class from gender and ethnicity and race and all those other things, that it's an inherent part of it. And I know you've even worked on ideas that connect environmental concerns with those types of issues, environmental justice. Would you care to talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, so you absolutely, to kind of expand on what I said a moment ago, you absolutely cannot exclude climate and environmental and biodiversity and ecological justice from the broader social justice movement. And really all of this that we're talking about in terms of diversity and inclusion, in terms of what we label progress and progressivism, is it all can be summed up, I think, fairly neatly in the terminology social justice. So, for example, the next tattoo I would like to get would be a social justice tree that incorporates all of these elements of social justice as one part of the trunk and the branches of a living tree, because they cannot be siloed off. And climate justice is the same way. And the way that it ties in is somewhat obvious, but maybe not. So the one tie-in would be that communities of color and poorer communities have traditionally borne the greatest burden of pollution, air pollution, water pollution. And in the climate crisis, they're the ones who are being hurt first and worst. The global south, so to speak, is being hurt first and worst. The nations and regions of the world that are considered less economically developed, I would say they are not so much less economically developed as they are more economically exploited by the rest, by the global north. But they're being hurt first and worst. Communities of color are being hurt first and worst. Indigenous communities are being hurt first and worst. They're losing their cultures, their traditions, their values, their lives. So obviously environmental justice relies on what we call intersectional environmentalism. We have to consider these communities who have been hurt the longest and hurt the worst and will continue to be at the top of our list of considerations. They've got to be right there at the top.
Right. And, growing up in Appalachia, and I certainly grew up in an extremely poor part of central Appalachia, you could see that all the time because it happens there as well. There are places not too far away from where I grew up that still have never seen clean running water as a utility, or that have huge open air mining pits, or mountains have had their tops blown off and the fill pushed over into streams and valleys to ruin the water quality. It's pretty obvious that that type of devastation in the name of energy and resources are pushed on top of poor people and people of color, and unfortunately that's usually the same folks. Not always, but usually. It's a point well taken. So that being said, it's said that movements run on the free labor and dedication of women and people of color and indigenous people in many cases. How does that statement apply to progressive movements?
I think it applies equally with all movements, and progressive movements are no exception. We have seen, quite frankly, progressive or ostensibly progressive organizations and groups taking advantage of especially women of color, or especially people of color, or people who volunteer their time and really aren't looking to be paid, or people who are paid staff, taking advantage of these folks for their labor. And that is, that's true even in progressive movements. There's really no exception to that, unfortunately. Or I use the term ostensibly progressive because I don't believe that really meets with what we should label progressive. But we have seen organizations, and I won't name names, but we have seen an organization in the state of West Virginia union busting. As a nonprofit organization, it was union busting. The moment that its staff talked about unionizing and collective bargaining, there was a huge blowback from its leadership. We've seen other organizations certainly discriminate, treat people with prejudice, treat people in ways that are patriarchal and misogynistic, and exhibit forms of white supremacy, whether or not they're knowingly doing so. They are doing these things. And I think any organization that calls itself progressive, any organization that claims to care about social justice and all of these issues that we can't silo off, has to first of all make sure every day, it's not something that you do once and then say, okay, we're clear, we're good for the rest of time. Every day you have to look at your organizational structure, the institution you've built, look at yourself, look at all the people participating and say, are we exhibiting any of these unacceptable behaviors and practices? We have to reassess ourselves all the time, because just as progressives or people who claim to be progressive or are ostensibly democratic socialists or whatever labels we prefer, we can't just assume that because those are our ideologies and thoughts and values and opinions that we're living up to them. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations and groups and individuals, even here in Central Appalachia, in West Virginia, are being put to the test on that, and for years now have been failing. And they need to reassess where they are.
And I think I know the organization in which you speak. There's also been a very public problem with the Democratic Party in West Virginia and its diversity and inclusion plan, where the plan was forced through by folks who were not on the hastily assembled diversity and inclusion planning committee without any consultation whatsoever, just to kind of check a box that had gone unchecked for over 4 decades. And so, I agree, you do see that. I think anytime you see an organization, regardless of its mission or goals, that looks that there's a color or gender line between the people who are serving and the people who are leading, you've discovered a problem, an innate problem, and tokenism doesn't help with that. And I think, we probably have to acknowledge the fact that you and I are two straight white guys talking about diversity and inclusion,
right.
and on one hand, that's something we have to acknowledge, but on the other, we also have to be willing to talk about it, because unfairly, as a general rule, we've been given influence outsized to our numbers, and in many cases outsized to our talents. Not you and I specifically, maybe, but so it's been clear that you have to have people who are advantaged in an unfair system to realize that they're advantaged and be willing to use their spot at the table to get other people a seat at the table. So it takes everyone, not just sitting back and hoping that someone else pulls that that diversity rabbit out of their hat and, oh, good, we're fixed, let's move along. So I think that's important to say too. So we've talked about some of the problems that progressive, or really any movement, could have in these terms. What do you think are some of the best practices for progressive movements in particular, so that they could be true to their principles when it comes to how they run their organizations?
Well, I think when it comes to things like unions and collective bargaining, we need to always be extremely open to that. I'm not saying that it works exactly the same at any and every group and organization, but when an organization fits the mold, no matter how big or how small, they need to consider collective bargaining rights are extremely important. So if you have employees, you need to consider that as an equalizer between management or oversight and your employees. So unionization is extremely important if we're going to live up to our values and being accepting of that. And it's also important to realize, especially in a state like West Virginia, we're so predominantly white. And we have a fairly homogenous population, at least in parts of the state, not all of the state. But you're not always going to exactly want to look just like the community that you're in. You want diversity of things like race and socioeconomic class and gender identity and sexual orientation. You want that diversity anyway. And it's not, demographically speaking, it's not always going to be easy to look at a community like, say, Parkersburg or Morgantown or whatever and say, well, we're this percentage, this. I mean, we can look at census data, we can look at the surveys that, of the population and try to determine what percentages, but it's not just about percentages. You need to, you may live in a broadly homogenous community, but you still need the input of folks like Black women, of like Indigenous people, if they're in your community, of the LGBTQIA plus community. You need that feedback. And I would argue that the vast majority of communities, even in states like West Virginia and regions like Appalachia, do have that level of diversity. They have a broad range of socioeconomic statuses, and they have a broad range of people. And there are things that aren't necessarily skin deep or innate characteristics that also lead people to be a more heterogeneous population. Things like you and I have dealt with in the past, like being a non-theist, a non-religious person, or a secular person, or someone who strongly supports separation of church and state, even if you have religious leanings. You need to be open to all of these different groups and get all of this different input that you can, even if you're in a relatively homogenous community or place. And you need to try to do better. The last point I would make on that is I think you need to try to do better than what's just the average or the median in your community. So if you can pay that higher wage, you need to be able to do that. If you can provide better benefits, you need to be able to do that. Outside of employment, if you can create best practices of your own that may not already exist in your community, you need to find ways to collaboratively do that and go above and beyond. If we're going to live, I mean, what else is progress if not going above and beyond?
Right. And, there's been a lot of scientific studies done of decision-making bodies, leadership bodies here in the past several years. They clearly show the more diverse your decision-making body, the more accurate the decision-making is. Even that it's even better than having just a room full of experts. If they're not a diverse room full of experts, then they're not making as good a set of decisions as they could be with diverse experts. So that's borne out in research, relatively recent research as well. So you are a leader in a local union for federal workers there where you live. There's a professor, Scott Galloway, who's gained some notoriety as I guess you would call him a utilitarian progressive with, as he himself says, a great big mouth. I enjoy listening to him quite a bit. And he's a professor at Cornell, I believe. I'm sorry, Columbia. He would hate me for that. He has stated that the best and most effective union in the past 20 or 30 years in the United States has been the federal government itself. That most unions have lost not only membership, but effective bargaining processes. And it's become more about how to lose the least instead of gain the most. And so he has said, so his theory is that government has had to step in, the Democrats typically, to assure advances in the workplace and related. What's your view on that?
Absolutely. I think that public sector unions have been an enormous success story and continue to be in many ways. When you talk about accomplishing diversity in the workplace, the federal workplace is extraordinarily diverse, in part because of the work of federal unions like the one that I'm a steward for. They have been, and honestly, you can tell that you've been successful when you make some popular enemies, when you make some big enemies in big places. So, why did Scott Walker in Wisconsin come after public unions so hard? He knew what he was doing.
Sure.
Why has the Supreme Court of the United States, the very conservative Supreme Court that we've had for a long time, even before the Trump era, why have they gone after public sector unions? They know where unions are still their strongest and where they're still making the biggest difference. And that really is, I would argue, in the federal government. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. As a steward, I have had people come to me about issues that aren't just about wealth gaps or issues with wages and salaries, earnings, more broadly, benefits, anything like that. I mean, those are issues that arise. But we've also had issues with, workplace safety and accommodations. We've had issues with discrimination in the workplace that have come through the union instead of maybe the more traditional channels. Right. We've had issues with, just relations with management and between employees. And the union they may not be the first office or, the first entity that you should seek out in some of these instances, but we're there with our master labor agreement in place. And we can say, this is unacceptable. Right. If we had one issue years ago, that we had to work with facilities on about nursing mothers. They had no place to go
Right.
to pump or to nurse. And some women were going out to their cars and things like that. And, one woman in particular happened to be a union member and come to us, and we were able to get accommodations for nursing mothers it was almost like facilities hadn't thought about it.
Right.
Right. So it was just kind of an afterthought. So the union is there on so many levels. And at the federal, you're right, in the federal government, in the public sector more broadly, especially the federal government, we have really excelled. And I would love to see that level of excellence and that level of camaraderie and solidarity in the private sector, and even at other levels of the public sector, like state and municipal government employees that unionize. I wish we could see that same success level, but they've been through a whole different,
Sure.
situation.
And as you know, I worked for state governments for quite a while, actually most of my career. And that's an interesting point about the nursing area, that and how that filtered down. So often that type of thing does start with the federal government making rules for its own employees that are more progressive or more inclusive than in industry or for state governments. But that starts to filter down if it stays there long enough. I can remember the federal government moving in that direction, and then the state institutions that I worked for being given directives to find places for mothers to nurse. And then, once the state government does that, and the federal government has already done it, then private employers become under pressure to provide that as well, because it becomes a quality of workplace issue that just comes to be expected. It's not as fast as passing a law saying you have to do this, and so thankfully there's some things that go that route. But even in the common pressure route can work as well. So that's an interesting point. Well, Eric, I wanted to thank you very much for being here and talking to us about the nature of progressive organizations and movements. You certainly have a ton of experience with that, and you continue to lead in a number of different directions, especially on the climate crisis, and as you pointed out, working actively as a member of your union. So thank you very much for what you do, and I'm sure you'll be back.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
At the end of every show, we remind you of something that you may have forgotten. In this case, let's talk about Manchin's nepotism. Nepotism? 100%. When his daughter was graduating from WVU with a bachelor's degree, he pushed for her hiring at Mylan Pharmaceuticals. How? Because he used his access to the owner of Mylan Pharmaceuticals while sitting beside of him in special seats at a WVU basketball game to hire his daughter. After she was hired, surprisingly, she rose through the ranks quickly, becoming a multimillionaire. She decided to go to graduate school at WVU for her MBA, except that she never finished it, even though she was allowed to graduate. She didn't finish her degree, it was found out, and it led to the resignation of the president of the university and the person in charge of that program. Nepotism. It's how we get things done in Appalachia all too often.